A nation divided imagining a second American Civil War. Look, nobody to talk about a second American Civil War, but the fact is the idea of a fractured America isn't some dystopian fantasy anymore. It's a conversation happening in hushed tones at family reunions and increasingly in not-so-hushed tones on cable news. This thought experiment is not a prediction, a call to arms, or a cheery bit of bedtime reading. It's a way to understand the complex factors that might come into play if America's deep political and social fissures were to crack wide open. Buckle up.
Imagine, if you will, the year is 2019. Donald Trump, he of the spray tan and Twitter tirades, is president. Now, I know what you're thinking. 2019? That's oddly specific. Feels a bit too real, doesn't it? And you'd be right, because the seeds of this hypothetical civil war were planted long before the first shot was hypothetically fired. America, you see, was already a nation divided. We're talking red states versus blue states, rural versus urban. A country split down the middle by ideology, identity, and a fundamental disagreement on what facts even mean anymore. Throw in a healthy dose of economic anxiety, a dash of racial tension, and a whole heaping helping of social media algorithms designed to keep us angry, and you've got yourself a recipe for disaster. The political climate, already heated, reaches a boiling point. Maybe it's a controversial Supreme Court decision, maybe it's an economic downturn that hits certain demographics harder than others. Or maybe it's just one too many tweets from a certain someone who shall remain nameless, but whose name rhymes with formaled frump. Whatever the catalyst, the tinder is dry, and it only takes a spark to set the whole damn thing ablaze. Regional factions, fueled by a potent cocktail of anger and ideology, begin to emerge. On one side, you have those who feel left behind by globalization and social change, clinging to traditional values and a longing for a bygone era of American dominance. On the other side, you have those who embrace diversity, social justice, and a more inclusive vision of America. This, my friends, is not how you solve a problem. This is how you pour gasoline on a dumpster fire.
Now, in any good hypothetical civil war, you need a good old-fashioned information war running parallel. And boy, did we deliver. Social media, that glorious bastion of cat videos and hot takes, transformed into a digital battleground. Remember those algorithms we mentioned earlier? The ones designed to keep us glued to our screens? Well, they found a new purpose in life. Radicalization. Misinformation spreads like wildfire, fueled by bots, trolls, and well-meaning but misinformed relatives sharing articles from dubious sources. It's the digital equivalent of your crazy uncle's conspiracy theory rant at Thanksgiving dinner, only amplified 1,000,000 times over and weaponized to sow discord and distrust. Each side retreats further into their own echo chambers, consuming only information that confirms their existing biases and demonizes the other. Nuance is dead. Critical thinking is on life support. Propaganda mills churn out clickbait headlines and emotionally charged narratives designed to manipulate public opinion. Facts become fluid, truth becomes subjective, and everyone becomes an expert in everything, thanks to the magical power of the internet. Traditional media outlets, struggling to compete in this new landscape, find themselves caught in the crossfire. Accusations of bias fly from both sides, and trust in journalism plummets to an all-time low. In this chaotic information ecosystem, controlling the narrative becomes paramount. Social media platforms, once hailed as tools of democratization, become instruments of division and manipulation. This information war, my friends, is not fought with bullets and bombs, but with memes and tweets and carefully curated news feeds. Because in a world where information is weaponized, the truth becomes the first casualty.
Now, let's talk about something everyone understands. Money, or rather, the lack thereof. Because when a nation decides to have a good old-fashioned internal squabble, the economy tends to take a bit of a nosedive. Think of it like this. You wouldn't invest in a company run by people who spent more time yelling at each other than actually doing their jobs, would you? The US economy, once the envy of the world, shudders to a halt. Supply chains, already strained by years of globalization, break down completely. Remember those empty shelves during the pandemic? Multiply that by, let's say, 1,000, and you're starting to get the picture. The stock market, that fickle beast, goes on a roller coaster ride that would make even the most hardened Wall Street trader lose their lunch. The value of the US dollar plummets, inflation skyrockets, and suddenly that stash of Beanie Babies you've been hoarding in your attic isn't looking so crazy after all. International trade grinds to a standstill as other countries watch in horror, wondering if America has finally lost its collective mind. The global economy, already teetering on the brink, plunges into a recession the likes of which we haven't seen since the Great Depression. It's like watching a slow-motion train wreck, only the train is the US economy, and we're all passengers.
Chapter 4. A House, Armed Military and Security Challenges. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, or rather the heavily armed elephant in the room, the United States military. Because when a country that spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined starts having a domestic dispute, well, let's just say things can get a little dicey. The US military, once a symbol of American might, finds itself caught in the middle of a conflict it never signed up for. Soldiers, sworn to protect and defend the Constitution, are forced to choose sides, their loyalties torn between duty and personal beliefs. It's a scenario straight out of a Tom Clancy novel, only this time it's real, and the stakes are infinitely higher. Questions of loyalty and chain of command plague every level of the armed forces. Units fracture along ideological lines, with some siding with the federal government and others throwing their support behind regional factions. It's a recipe for chaos, and the potential for bloodshed within the ranks is very real. Military bases, once symbols of American power, become potential flashpoints for violence as factions clash over control of weapons, equipment, and strategic assets. Imagine the National Guard deployed not to quell riots or provide disaster relief, but to face off against their fellow Americans. It's the worst-case scenario for a nation founded on the principle of strength through unity.
Chapter 5. The Human Cost, a Nation in Crisis. Now, let's talk about the real victims in any war, real or imagined ordinary people. Because when the bombs start dropping, metaphorically speaking of course, it's the everyday folks who bear the brunt of the suffering. Imagine cities, once vibrant hubs of commerce and culture, transformed into battlegrounds. Streets littered with rubble, buildings scarred by gunfire, and the constant fear of violence hanging in the air like a thick fog. It's a scene straight out of a dystopian novel, yet all too real for those caught in the crossfire. Millions are displaced from their homes, fleeing the fighting and seeking refuge in overcrowded camps, or with relatives in safer parts of the country. Families are torn apart, lives are upended, and the social fabric of the nation is shredded beyond recognition. Food and medical supplies run short, basic services like electricity and clean water become luxuries, and diseases spread like wildfire in the absence of proper sanitation and healthcare. It's a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions, and the international community struggles to respond to the sheer scale of the need.
Chapter 6. Picking up the pieces, the long road to reconciliation. Now let's talk about the hardest part of any conflict, ending it. Because once the guns fall silent, the real work begins. The process of rebuilding a shattered nation, healing the wounds of division, and reconciling with the ghosts of the past is a long and arduous one. A ceasefire, brokered by international mediators and weary from the endless bloodshed, finally brings an end to the fighting. But the road to peace is paved with mistrust, resentment, and the lingering trauma of a nation torn apart. It's a fragile peace, one that could easily shatter if not nurtured with care. War crimes trials, while necessary to hold those responsible for atrocities accountable, risk inflaming tensions and reopening old wounds. The question of how to balance justice with reconciliation becomes a central challenge, one with no easy answers. The process of rebuilding infrastructure, restarting the economy, and restoring basic services is daunting. The cost of the conflict, both in terms of human life and economic devastation, is staggering. Perhaps the most difficult task of all is rebuilding trust. Look, I know what you're thinking. That was bleak. Can I have a hug? And fair enough, but remember, this was a hypothetical scenario, a thought experiment in what could happen if we let our divisions consume us. It's a stark reminder that the things that unite us, our shared humanity, our common goals, Our love for this country, flaws and all, are far more powerful than the things that divide us. Understanding the potential impacts can encourage dialogue and foster unity, preventing such a situation from ever becoming reality, because the only way to avoid the abyss is to acknowledge it exists and then, collectively, take a giant step back from the edge.